So everybody, this section I'm going to call it, I think, the armchair prepper, because although people like to laugh at armchair preppers, I feel most comfortable sitting in my armchair, having a nice cup of coffee without alcohol, and reading books. Books for me transport me to other people's worlds, and I think one of the major things we all forget a lot about in the prepping community is the fact that as of yet, for recorded history anyway, humanity has never suffered a global catastrophe where civilization globally has been crashed or severely damaged. And for everybody like me out there that's going to tell you we have no idea what it will be like, you're going to get 100, 1,000 people who are talking out of their bums telling you this is what it will be like, you need to do this, you need to do that. I mean, obviously there's certain things we all can agree on: water, food, security, comms, medical, etc, etc. But at the end of the day, a global catastrophe to affect civilization will, by its nature, kill most preppers. And those who survive will either be preppers or not, and may or may not be lucky enough to have supplies and stuff like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick some books and just show you some of my taste. Some of these I'm going to review in the future, and some of them I'm not. Like I said, I'll show you the book in a minute, what we'll do next time. Some classics. I don't know if I'll do this one, but I really like Ballad. This is of course been made into a not a great film. High Rise, film's okay if it's on free on Netflix, but the book itself's pretty good, and his stuff's pretty good. It's a bit dry and a bit dated, but it's pretty good. Of course, most people who read science fiction are into Doris Lessing, especially if they're Canadian, and let's face it, if you're not into science fiction and you're not Canadian, perhaps you should move. Anyway, the Mara and Dan trilogy, it's okay. Is there lessons for prepping in this? Probably not. However, this stuff, these are classic stuff. If you like Mara and Dan, like Doris Lessing, find these books. The Canopus in Argos archive series. This is the first volume in the series of Shikasta. It's blowing minds when it was made. Pretty good stuff. Very interesting. A Canticle for Leibowitz. This is the not very good follow-up book that he finally did. St. Leibowitz and No Wild Horsewoman. It's not that bad. I'd give it a skip unless you really are into apocalyptic science fiction. It's not that good. Canticle for Leibowitz. I think it's compulsory reading for anybody that claims to be a prepper. Oh, science books. Ursula Le Guin, great sci-fi, well worth reading. What about other stuff? There's classics out there. This is about Arctic exploration. It's mostly what goes wrong and what goes right, and this sort of stuff is very useful if you can get through it, because it's archaic language, and that's difficult for some people, but it's well worth it. Pretty much everybody will have books like this floating around. Pretty much everybody who has books like this have them like I have them, stored away and maybe going to be used. Frankly, this is terrible. Don't bother getting a book like this unless you're actually going to carry it around and use it frequently. That's a major failing of mine. I'm going to work on that. You can get this as a free download, but you really should have a hard copy. It's pretty good. It's a little dated, but you know, if North Korea ever starts lobbing bombs or China and Russia ever get serious on America, pretty good stuff. But you know what? You don't have to look at prepping apocalyptic fiction and stop at 1 second after, which I think isn't a very good book, for various reasons. I may or may not review it. I don't know. Nobody loves it. Frankly, it's silly. Bill Bryson, great guy. He actually walked the Appalachian Trail. I tried to walk part of it. Great tale because he's basically an unprepared, unfit slob with no idea what he's doing, trying to walk the Appalachian Trail with a drunk. Great literature he writes well. This stuff has actually got stuff in it that could be of use. What I'm going to review in about 2 to 3, maybe 4 weeks is this one. Mary Shelley, The Last Man. really dated because it's really old. She wrote a book called Frankenstein about a doctor who was messing around with biochemistry. You may have seen a film or read the book. One of the things I'm going to do is point out to people that some of the stuff I'm going to review, I'll probably do one Boy and His Dog. Probably will. They're available on film. It's always easy to watch a book on film, but really to get the full strength of what an author is saying, pretty much always, unless it's Stephen King, you need to read the book. And I'm almost at the end of the Stephen King Gunslinger trilogy. So, today what I'm going to talk about is a very short story written in 1912 by an author you might have heard of called Jack London. This book is really interesting. It is available digitally, and of course digital is the way to go if you don't care about keeping stuff in the apocalypse. This one's called The Scarlet Plague. Now again, right, this is a guy that's churning out short stories for fiction magazines of all types to make money. And he was actually one of the first kind of very rich authors of the day. And he wrote this book, and it's actually powerful. In 2017, it's very powerful. So the book is set in 2073. A plague wiped out pretty much every human being in about 2 weeks in 2013. Obviously, he got that wrong. And it is pretty dated in places, and I still think it makes a good short read. You can get a cheap copy of this, or get it from the library, remember those? Or online, it's worth reading, it's kind of interesting. So I'm going to read bits of it, but not too much, and I'm going to talk about bits of it. So, chapter 1, the way led I'm not a professional. The way led along upon what had once been the embankment of a railroad, but no train had run upon it for many years. The forests on either side swelled up the slopes of the embankment and crested across it in a green wave of trees and bushes. The trail was as narrow as a man's body, and was no more than a wild animal runway. Occasionally, a piece of rusty iron showing through the forest mould advertised that the rail and the ties still remained. In one place, a 10-inch tree bursting through at a connection had lifted the end of a rail clearly into view. The tie had evidently followed the rail, held to it by the spike long enough for its bed to be filled with gravel and rotten leaves, so that now the crumbling rotten timber thrust itself up at a curious slant. Old as the road was, it was manifest that it had been of the monorail type. Alright, so that's kind of how it is. It's a lot of one guy speaking about the past. Hey bear. So what does the book get right? It gets a lot of science right in an interesting way. The president was appointed in 2012, and it wasn't President Obama, it was some other guy. And he was appointed by the heads of the corporations. You could argue this is still true today, given the role of finance in American elections. Over the 60 years since the fall of humanity, a very swift fall. Probably the entire population of the planet dropped to about maybe 2,000, 3,000 people in about 2 weeks' time. So that's pretty hard to get over as a society. The language has now devolved and been corrupted. So the storyteller Grancer is telling his grandchildren, who are basically wild savages. They're all goat herders. They eat goat, they drink goat milk, and they wear goat clothing. And they herd the goats around, protecting them from wild animals. This is about as high culture as they have 60 years later. So they're set in Southern California, and the whole ecosystem within the 60 years has completely changed. Crabs are now plentiful on every beaches. Wolves and bears and mountain lions are back in force everywhere. Everywhere the vegetation is wild, and there is absolutely no sense left in the landscape that it was ever tilled by the hand of man. Agriculture has gone, and strangely enough they've not managed to save any form of agrarian agriculture other than goat herding. So Grancer is a corruption of grandfather, and what's nice about the book is that they just use normal English for the time. They don't try and, they just say they're not talking this way, and they would sound like grunts to you. The survivor, this is interesting from a prepping point of view, is actually a university professor of literature, English literature. And in one part of the book he actually complains because no chemist or physicist survived. No engineers particularly survived. So civilization fell hard and had nowhere to come up from. Now, for a story written in 1912, Jack London really gets it, a lot of things really eerily correct. He prophesies that in 2012 the whole world population would be 8 billion people, which is slightly higher than it actually was, but pretty close to the money. And he says lots of things about food in this book. This is an example. Mankind knew a great deal more about getting food, and the more food there was, the more people there were. So this is the central collapse, central concern of the collapse world of 2007. He's actually getting food. Food is no longer plentiful, it's no longer dependent, it's problems. And I love this line, and I think we need to think about this as preppers. I sometimes think the most wonderful achievement of our tremendous civilization was food. Its inconceivable abundance, its infinite variety, its marvellous delicacy, its inconceivable abundance, its infinite variety. Oh, my grandsons, life was life in those days when we had such wonderful things to eat. So think about that the next time you go and you decide to buy some food for storage. Yep, white rice, beans, blah, blah, blah. You know, get some really nice spices, some really strange spices that will make a difference to your palate. Think about tinned food that could last a long time that you might not consider buying, but maybe you should. I mean, if money's tight, don't buy tinned salmon, buy lots of cheap tuna, but maybe occasionally buy some expensive salmon and hold it back. Now, a central position in Jack London's book is that food becomes abundant with technology, so therefore humans can multiply. Now, when humans multiply, they congregate in the great cities. This allows bacteria to swarm and multiply. The book goes into slightly more detail, but there's been several plagues in the past that have been pretty devastating, where they've been stopped by science. This time, no, it was not stopped. So there will inevitably be a plague that will destroy civilization so completely it will appear that the civilization destroyed by the bacterial plague almost never existed. The book then also says depressingly that humanity will then always inevitably rebuild and rebreed, which will lead to human conflicts, which will lead to technology, which will lead to more conflict, which will lead to more conquest, which will eventually lead to more agriculture, which will eventually lead to more people, which will eventually lead to abundant food, which will eventually lead to great plagues again. So that's kind of a sad way of looking at life, but you know, there might be some truth in that. Now, the speed of the Scarlet Plague is what utterly crushes people, and this is to be borne in mind. What we want for a societal world-ending plague is an extremely fast transmission, an extremely fast symptomology, and an extremely high kill rate. So if I catch it, I'm infectious for about an hour or two, then I have the symptoms and I die in an hour or two. A plague like that's going to be self-limiting. The plague London envisages is actually one of the worst possible. You have an incredibly long, it doesn't say, but incredibly long period of weeks where people can pass the infection along without any symptoms whatsoever. When the symptoms arrive, they kill within 15 minutes to 4 hours. So by the time people start dying, pretty much the entire world, because the world is a connected world, are infected. So the only people that actually can survive aren't the people who've prepped and go to bug out locations, but they're just the random lucky immune people, which in this case is probably about 1 in a million. Now, he describes the disease extremely well. It's a flushing scarlet of the face, and then you get numbing paralysis starting in the toes and moving up the legs, kind of like a Guillain-Barré situation. Now, he gets it wrong. He says that they die when the paralysis hits the heart. Actually, people would die from that when the paralysis stops the lungs from functioning. Now, there's no ventilatory treatment in 1912, so they can't save anybody at all. But I think he does describe it very realistically, a sudden and massive terminal plague. There is no survival. You get it, you're dead within 15 minutes to 4 hours. Dead. And nobody survives. And it's coming up all around the world at the same time. He feels that this will unleash an immediate fear and panic, leading to everybody abandoning society, work and social values. I think he's probably true in that. I mean, you know, if we think we have a chance of stability, we go for the normalcy bias. But if we know this is it, we are screwed, panic and fear will break out. And I think I agree as well that fear, this type of fear, can actually be very, very numbing when faced with the unknown and the fatal. What's missing in the book, obviously, is TV and the internet. But I think he's describing fear being transmitted by newspapers on the wireless and by airships arriving. Yeah, in our connected world, before the connection drops, it's failed, yeah, the fear would be rapid and ongoing. When you think about things like that were very tiny, like SARS, back in the beginning of the 2000s, the fear and panic that broke out. Now, if you're actually having not a couple of hundred people infected and die, but you're having, you know, 200 million people die in the first 4 days. The next 4 days, 800, 900 million people die. Imagine that type of panic, especially how the TV crews would react to it. It would be wall-to-wall news coverage. Now, he describes that the great cities of the world go silent one by one. I think he does this great. I don't think preppers really get this. The world contracts from being a global entity to silence, to what you can see and hear yourself within a couple of weeks, and stays that way for at least 60 years of this book. What I think is also correct is in this type of a scenario, people flee the cities, and that's interesting. Now, I'm just going to read an excerpt from chapter 3. There is plenty of interesting stuff in this, but this one I'm going to read. New York City and Chicago were in chaos, and what happened with them was happening in all the large cities. A third of the New York police were dead. This is very early on. Their chief was also dead, likewise the mayor. All law and order had ceased. The bodies were lying in the streets unburied. All railroads and vessels carrying food and such things into the great city had ceased runnings, and the mobs of the hungry poor were pillaging the storehouses and warehouses. Murder and robbery and drunkenness were everywhere. Already the people had fled from the city by the millions. At first the rich in their private motor cars and dirigibles. You kind of get mass transit wrong, but it's interesting. And then the great mass of the population on foot, carrying the plague with them, themselves starving and pillaging the farmers and all the towns along the way. So there you go. The horde attacking the rural areas in SHTF, 1912. Communication, the total collapse of communication, how are you going to respond to that? Absolute silence. No radio, no TV, no internet, no newspapers, nobody travelling by car, nobody travelling by plane. What you know is what you can see and hear with your own eyes. And to find new information out, you have to walk and find, or cycle and find people. This is another quote. It was amazing, astounding, this loss of communication with the world. It was exactly as if the world had ceased, had been blotted out. So these people are suddenly cut off from all communication. Everybody's dying, and fear and rage is everywhere. So as the people flee from certain death, there are again warnings for us in 2017 from this old book. There were numerous stalled motor cars showing that the gasoline and the engine supplies to the garages had given out. So this is a world without major electricity use and without communications in this book. Now think about a sudden collapse now in 2017. Gasoline will run out, food and water, etc. very, 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 very quickly. This is kind of what I think it will be like. People slip by silently, furtively, like ghosts, white-faced women carrying infants in their arms, fathers leading children by the hand, singly and in couples. Some carried food, others blankets and valuables. And there were many who carried nothing. A sudden collapse is a major dislocation. We need to have a plan if we ever need to flee and have stuff ready to literally grab. We should have our go bags, our inch bags, our bug out bags, our whatever bags. And we should have somewhere to go. We should have a plan about this is where we're going to go. And you should have supplies already there, etc., etc. Now, what's the point in this book of having any preps at all? There is none. It's a lottery system. You have a 1 in a million chance of living. that's it. However, the terror of fleeing from certain death with nothing and nowhere to go must be really, really utterly terrifying. At least a prepper who's going to die from the Scarlet Plague anyway has things to occupy their minds, has tasks to do for their family, has a plan to move forward, and then they move forward with the plan and they get the Scarlet Death and die in 15 minutes to a couple of hours anyway. But you've spared yourself a lot of stress by just having a plan. Now this is fascinating. So the narrator uses the phone, the telephone while it's still remaining. So he contacts 60 people he feels it should gather, and they are going to gather inside the Berkeley University in California in a stone building, the chemistry building that's actually separated from everywhere else, because he figures fire is going to be an issue. And he's right. Fires, accidental and human, cause people to start burning stuff. Rich houses get set fire and it spreads, all that sort of thing. Now he knows the route and he's going there on foot, and he actually has a really hard time getting there. And it's not well described in the book, but I think it'd be interesting. We need to have our bug out routes known to us, known to our families, and we should have alternates. And we should have real strong feelings about how to get from A to B if there's a major fire or a major issue in between. I don't think we're that good at that. I think we kind of look at fast routes and then we look at maybe the 1 or 2 side routes, but we don't look at going south when we need to go north for a long way to avoid this and that to get to the north. So the plans need to be flexible, and this again I think is important for people to listen to. By our plans we'd arranged for a company of 60 to be in this refuge. Instead, every one of the number originally planned had added relatives and friends and whole families until there were over 400 souls. I personally think this is a very good view of what would happen at a known bug out location, discrete aggressive pre-planning. And for all the armchair preppers out there who say, I'll just put a bullet in anybody's head that shows up at my bug out location. In a sudden collapse like this, normalcy bias is still going to be very much operating. And panic and fear and chaos are all around you. And frankly, in this type of a scenario, you know that once the masks die off, what will be left will be a fairly abundant world for a while. So I'm not really seeing why you would need to execute anybody that brings an extra cousin or other neighbour with them. Well, you know, you might want to. So eventually, due to fire and attack and death inside their redoubt, they also feel they need to flee the city. And again, this is a powerful lesson for us in 2017. This is a quote again. Our progress was painfully slow. The women and children could not walk fast. They did not dream of walking, my grandsons, in the way all people walk today. In truth, none of us knew how to walk. It was not until after the plague that we really learned how to walk. So it was that the pace of the slowest was the pace of all, for we dared not separate on account of the prowlers. The prowlers are a few people who haven't quite died yet that actually just enjoy shooting people because they've kind of gone nuts. Now if you had to bug out and you had to walk there, what would your group's pace be, realistically? And how many miles could they actually walk? And those are things I think we very much overestimate. Not a live man, woman or child did I encounter, though the dead were everywhere. Food, however, was abundant. So in a sudden massive collapse, it kills almost the entire population in a very short period of time. The unused food stores, etc. will be around. There'll be lots of food, there'll be lots of equipment. However, in the book, in a few short years, that abundance becomes famine. So I think if we ever are in the unlikely situation of this type of survival situation and survive, get over yourself. Don't cry and mope around and drink alcohol and smoke cigars and eat tins, caviar. Get your butt moving. Go out there, find cars at work, find bands at work, transport stuff, central location, store. U-Haul vans. Take them, drive them to warehouses and stores, fill them up with stuff that won't rot. Drive the U-Haul vans into a central location, preferably inside a well-built warehouse. Think about 20, 30, 40 years down the line. This didn't happen in this book. Society fell hard and did not recover. Now the dogs change rapidly. All the small ones and the large ones, the very large will die off quickly, and you basically get a hybrid wolf-type dog within a decade. Most of the domestic animals also die without humanity, and the surviving varieties are much different. Bear in mind, feedlots and intensive farming don't exist in 12. What cows are left actually use the mountainsides for protection. They move up and down the mountainsides, avoiding the bears, avoiding the mountain lions. Kind of interesting. What passes for a chicken is wild and really dangerous. Because you think what male chickens can be like. Roosters, I guess. The horses also become feral, and they become basically one type of a small Mustang. Everything humanity's imposed upon the natural world degenerates within 10 to 30 years, which I think is interesting. Fire services. Within 3 years, all the land had been splendidly tilled. All the land had been splendidly tilled, and now I scarcely recognise it was such a sea of rank vegetation that had overrun the agricultural handiwork of man. You see, the wheat, the vegetables, and orchard trees had always been cared for and nursed by man, so they were soft and tender. The weeds and wild bushes and such things, on the contrary, had always been fought by man, so they were tough and resistant. Largely I think this is true, though I do know of an orchard that's been abandoned for about 50 years, an apple orchard, and it's there is serviceable apples that come there every fall, but I think by and large he's correct. I think when you add in our use of agricultural pesticides and GMO crops, and the fact that most of our soil is sterile or dead without heavy use of nitrates from petroleum, I think the terminal decline of food crops in 2017 in a very short period of time would be incredible. We need to know how to maintain soil, we need to know how to improve soil, we need how to germinate, we need to know how to grow things. So I'm almost at the end, and thanks for bearing with me. I'm just going to read the last 3 short paragraphs, and I do recommend getting this one because it's interesting. And these last 3 clips. "What is it?" Grancer queried. "Horses," was the answer. "First time I've seen him on the beach. It's the mountain lions getting thicker and thicker and driving him down." The low sun shot red shafts of light, fan-shaped up from a cloud-tumbled horizon, and close at hand in the white waste of shore-lashed waters, the sea lions, bellowing their old primeval chant, hauled up out of the sea on the black rocks and fought and loved. "Come on, Grancer," Edwin prompted, and the old man and the boy, skin-clad and barbaric, turned and went along the right of way into the forest in the wake of the goats. So there you have it. Overall, I think the book is short enough to be read by almost everyone today, and I believe it's an okay read. I didn't personally bond with any of the characters or particularly care about them. It's kind of stilted in that way. But the story did hit hard for me. I mean, it's really apocalyptic, no doubt about it. And a world without almost anyone. Think about that. If you actually manage to survive, and you're not going to be able to prep to survive this type of a scenario, but you could prep to survive a super pandemic that doesn't kill quite so many and is slower in passing. 3 men survive in the entirety of the Utah state, and all 3 men after about 10-20 years can't stand it any longer. So they decide to trek to California. California being populated, they figure there must be women there. They become desperate to find women. Men without women become desperate to find women. 2 of them die crossing the desert, and one of them makes it. The entire emptiness of this new world without humanity becomes very alien to surviving humanity, and it's worth reading. Now, the book itself is no Call of the Wild, but I think it does deserve a wider audience. Now, I hope you enjoyed that. And like you say, for me next, after I finish the Gunslinger 8 books from Stephen King, I'm almost at the end of that, I'm going to actually do this one, as I said, Mary Shelley. Now I'm going to talk about why some of my books are in this kind of a format, expensive type books with good bindings, in a separate video. But if you can get a digital copy or a cheap copy of The Last Man by Mary Shelley, feel free to engage below the line when I do this, and we can chat about the book. What I'm going to do is read it, and I'm going to give you a brief overview of it, some selection of the parts that I think are great, and then talk about what prepping lessons are in this book for us. Anyway, that's all from me, and as ever, it's time to say goodbye from Mr. Bear. Au revoir.